Thank God for people like my guest today. John Sharifi is a virologist who is very, very interesting, unique job. When I met him at Taikai and I was getting to know him a little bit more, I was thinking to myself, wow, I don't think I've met anybody who's a virologist or who studies in that line of work. So I thought it'd be a really cool idea to invite him onto the podcast and to kind of share his knowledge on how viruses work, how people like him spend time trying to combat different viruses. I mean, geez, I didn't even know that viruses could attack your body in multiple different ways, and there's different strategies and plans of attacks those viruses affect your body. Overall, I learned a lot from this podcast, and just from John being so kind and genuine, he was able to like really explain it into simple terms and gave me really great examples and metaphors that I can kind of grasp some of the understandings from this. So I hope you take away some cool things from this podcast, much like I did, because John's a very smart guy, and I'm lucky that I had a chance to talk to him for an hour. So I hope you enjoy this episode with John Sharifi. Okay, perfect. So why don't you just give your name, introduce yourself, and say what you do.
Sure. First of all, I appreciate you having me on the podcast. I think it's a good opportunity to speak to the general public and
Yeah.
hopefully dispel some misinformation and give them the data as accurate as it is at the current moment. So my name is John Sharifi, and I got my doctorate in biomedical research from the Department of Immunology and Microbial Disease at Albany Medical College. I studied virus-host interactions, particularly with HIV. I did a postdoc there, which is essentially the equivalent of like a residency that a physician would do. And then I walked across the street and got a job as an assistant professor at the Albany College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences.
Whoa.
An assistant professor, associate professor, and professor, for those who are unfamiliar with academia, it's basically like a white belt, blue belt, black belt. It's just a ranking system.
Gotcha.
So I was there for about 5 or so years, and then I came to the Syracuse area for family reasons. Currently, I'm doing what's called a visiting assistant professorship at Lemoyne. So it's a 1-year appointment. I'm teaching microbiology, and I'm actually spending my quote unquote free time writing a manuscript based on the research that was conducted when I was at the pharmacy school.
Nice. And when you were at the pharmacy school, what were you focusing on specifically?
So I carried over the work from my postdoc, which in a bit carried on from my graduate studies. But when I was a postdoc, there was a good friend, graduate student. She's now moved on to other things, Andrea Ferreria, and she had serendipitously found that there was a compound in from cruciferous vegetables called sulforaphane that apparently appeared to block HIV infection in one of the 2 major cell types that it infects.
In a vegetable?
Oh yeah. I'm telling you, there's a reason why your parents say to eat your vegetables, and there's a lot of stuff in there that we don't know about.
Holy shit.
Yeah, so we published on that, and then that was a good chunk of my postdoc. And then when I was in the pharmacy school as a professor, I continued to collaborate with the folks at Albany Med, and basically so it's blocking HIV. How's it doing it? That was essentially the bulk of my research. And what we're writing now is the way it's working is, so all viruses, in order to replicate, they have to get inside a target cell, and then they hijack the machinery of the cell and they trick the cell into making more virus. And exactly. And sometimes that kills the cell, and sometimes it just allows the virus to spread to other cells. But the cells don't just sit there and say, oh, I'm getting infected, that's it. They actually recruit a number of molecules and proteins inside the cell that try to defeat the virus. And so there's this fight that ensues.
Right.
And what we found in what I'm writing up now and hope to get out for publication soon is that the sulforaphane is taking this protein that acts as an antiviral factor that has the ability to block HIV, and it's activating it. So it's turning Bruce Banner into the Hulk, so that when the virus arrives, it basically
Mm,
gets treated like Loki and smashed around and
yes.
destroyed. So
That's
it's
great.
really cool.
I love that you explain it. You like give me like the scientific term and then you're like, okay, here's how you can compartmentalize it. Here's a marvel.
I will use a lot of analogies.
I
Some are
like that.
going to
That's
be
how I
good,
learn. I
some are
learn way
probably
better
going
that
to be
way.
bad. Good, great.
So what's like a normal day, or I should say, so you're currently writing on that. Is it in specific vegetables or is it across the board? Any like leafy green vegetable?
Cruciferous vegetables, which are apparently those that have like four leaves shaped like a cross. So I'm assuming
Oh,
cauliflower and broccoli are the big ones.
oh,
Um, but really, what it is it's a tool. It's like a flashlight. It's telling us that there's a pathway within the cell that if we turn it on or activate it, we can stop the virus. So if we're out in the dark and suddenly we turn the flashlight on, then the pathway is sort of lit up. And once you understand the trail, you can try to figure out multiple different points in the trail where you could intervene. So maybe sulforaphane works okay, but maybe we could use something else somewhere else down the line that works better. So
uh,
it's revealing a pathway that we can potentially exploit therapeutically.
it's almost like you're giving the cell, like you said, you're turning it into Bruce Banner. Is it like you're giving it like juicing it up and making it like beefy and able to fight the virus? Is
Exactly.
is that the idea behind a lot of different like vaccines? Like that's the idea, is it juices up our current cells, or is it does it work differently?
It's kind of like if you're going to rob a bank, right? If the bank robbers come and they rob the bank and they take the money, well, the money's gone. But if you give the security guards and the bank tellers and everybody a heads up and say, be on the lookout, there's these robbers, they have these masks, they're going to show up and they're going to look like this. And what'll happen is basically you're ready for when it arrives. So what a vaccine does is it kind of gives all of this information to the immune system that says, be on the lookout. If you see this, you're about to get robbed. So the moment
Hmm,
the robbers walk through the door, the security guards are there, they're ready for them, and it gets shut down. So that's how a vaccine works.
gotcha. Okay, and that's like across the board. And is this in hopes of turning like it sounds like a legitimate cure for HIV, and I know like in today's standards it's very treatable, but is the end game for this to be like an injection and completely cure somebody?
The thing about science that a lot of people don't quite realize is that it's more of a matter of, so at this level, it's what is termed basic research. And I don't like the term basic. I like to think of it as fundamental research. We're starting to understand these these fundamental pathways that we didn't quite understand before. And as we start to gain knowledge, we can build on that knowledge. And to be truthful, the direction that it goes is really unpredictable.
Yeah.
Knowledge is power. You're not sure where certain knowledge is going to go. And I can give you an excellent example. The study of HIV to begin with in the 80s, when we first found out that there was this virus causing this immune deficiency disorder, obviously the intention was to study this virus to cure that disease or prevent it from progressing or prevent it, period, with a vaccine or what have you. Treating the disease was the idea. But as we started to learn the molecular biology of how this virus replicates, then we were able to start to use it as a tool to treat diseases that are completely unrelated
Oh.
that you wouldn't even have realized when you first started it. So for example, all viruses, what they need to do is they need to get their genetic information, their blueprint into the cell. What that does is the cell uses that information inadvertently, it gets tricked into using that information to make more virus. Well, what if we could decide what the blueprint is going to be?
Oh shit.
And then we put that information into a virus like a Trojan horse and have it deliver the information we want into a cell. So a few years ago, there's this thing called CAR T cell therapy. And I'm not going to get into the complicated biology of it, but the idea was that individuals who have certain blood cancers, what we do is we take their immune cells, and we as in the royal we, the scientific community, and we take a gutted version of HIV. We take some of their immune cells out. We take this gutted version of HIV and we put the blueprint for a protein that would recognize the cancer cells. So we use the virus to deliver the information to the immune cells that say, this is what the cancer looks like. Put the
Mhm.
immune cells back into the person, and now those immune cells will recognize and kill the cancer.
Right.
Nobody would have predicted that when
Right.
HIV was first being studied.
Right.
So
Wow,
where
that's cool.
sulforaphane leads.
It's just like you had said earlier. It's almost like you had showed the security guards the wanted posters. This is
Exactly.
what our suspect should look like. You showed them and you're like, here, this is what they look like. They get in here and you need to mess them up.
Exactly. And who would have thought HIV was the tool that we used to teach the immune cells how to fight cancer?
Wow. Wow.
So
And
who
that's not
knows?
even like as big of a deal anymore, right? Like it seems to be pretty manageable and actually cost effective now for something that 20 years ago, 30 years ago was wiping people out.
Absolutely. And it's all because we studied the fundamental molecular biology of the virus. When we understood our enemy, we could figure out ways to defeat it.
Now you're putting together, you said a book, right, for this, or is it research?
It's a scientific paper.
Okay.
So it's
So
basically going to show the data that we collected and say that, hey, just so you're aware, scientific world, when we use sulforaphane, it's activating this pathway, which is doing this to defeat the virus. And then somebody somewhere down the roads, possibly us or another lab, will pick up on that and build further.
that's what I love so much about like the scientific community is it seems to be like across the board everybody wants to give equal access to everybody on like this kind of information. My friend John Hess works. He's a neuroscientist, and he was saying how him and his group or his lab were starting to study different genomes, and you could find different genomes that would signal like John's. You have a certain genome number that correlates to a high percentage of having Alzheimer's by the time you're 80, and he basically is putting this out and also running the tests on it with uh, brain cadavers and blood and different samples and releasing that out to the public, like to all other scientists. Is that the way it is across the board, no matter like if you're in biology or microbiology or whatever facet of science?
In the biological sciences, I can't speak so much for like the other sciences, but it's generally the idea is
That's
you
so
collect.
cool.
Yeah, yeah, and it all builds. It's just I think it was Newton who said, "I stand on the shoulder of giants," and all that means is that that fundamental research starts to build and build and build and build, and then as we acquire more knowledge, eventually it reaches the clinic. So, sharing the data, a very important thing to note though is the data is peer reviewed. So you put your information out there, and then other experts in the field must look at it and say, okay, your experiments were solid, your data is
Mm,
reasonable to conclude, and then it goes out there and then it's out in the ether. And in theory, if it's government funded, eventually it has to be accessible by everybody, the layperson, the taxpayer, etc. But yeah,
right.
get that information out there and build upon it.
Interesting. And so when you sit down to write this scientific journal, right? Is that what the name is?
Yeah, it'll go to a scientific journal.
So when you sit down to write that, what is the process like, and how do you start on a project like that?
So it literally builds off of the previous project, which built off of the data from others, et cetera, et cetera. So
Uh,
I would start off by explaining our initial observations with sulforaphane that we published previously and say, this is what we saw. and this is what's out in the field, and these are the experiments we did. This is why we did them, and now this is what we see now. And it's kind of like the follow-up, the sequel to the previous story, and it
Gotcha.
takes it a little bit further. And then we say, this is the data, this is the results, and then we usually typically end with a discussion saying, okay, this is how we could interpret this, this is possibly a next direction, etc., and then we send it out.
Now, I've never seen one of those before. Are they usually like a one-page essay, or is this like a 20-page document with
Oh, it depends. It can be extensive. It can have a one author. It can have a 50 authors. It's kind of dependent on the journal and the process, but typically your average scientific paper, something like this, is 4 or 5 pages. The journals will kind of dictate. Everything's online now, so that you can usually get away with putting more. But I'm happy to like share one with you. But
yeah.
yeah, it's yeah, 4 or 5 pages. The thing is, though, the downside is that a lot of times it's kind of written towards the scientific community, so a lot of it sounds like gibberish and
Mm,
acronyms.
yeah.
So, but pretty much any scientist, if you reach out to them, is willing to explain it in terms that the general public would better understand, and I think that's a good thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I am all for sharing information. I think that's one of the coolest things about just the age we live in right now. It's just you can literally type in Google anything and you learn how to knit in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like there's just so much stuff, so much information out there.
You
But it
learn
seems
some
like
reverse stance.
what's that?
You learn some reverse stance techniques.
That's right, dude. That's the cool thing about Taikai is like I feel like I always meet these like really cool people in all these different hobbies, and a lot of times like I'll see you for maybe 2 hours a week, and when we're there, we're like, John, what's up, dude? How's all right?
Yeah.
So we're gonna this is the combo we're gonna do. I never get the opportunity to be like, John, what is it that you do for a living, and like really see that like you're an expert in the field, especially for like, how long have you been in this career?
So I would say if we start from when I entered graduate school, probably 2009.
Yeah, so I mean, a really long time. Really have
Yeah.
seen some like really impressive. What's like what was the point that wanted you to get into this job in this career path?
So my father was a high school biology teacher, and as I was growing up, he obviously explained the natural world to me. So, um, it was something that caught my interest very early on, and it's kind of interesting when you get the birds and the bees talk from somebody who's a biology teacher. It's
Yeah,
very,
all scientific
yeah,
names.
exactly. So I kind of fell in love with the biological sciences from an early age, and then I went to college and I decided to major in biology. And most students who go into biology, they think that you're either going to become an ecologist or a physician, and I was one of those that didn't really realize the breadth of opportunities that were available to me.
Outside of those two jobs.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So, as I was going through my undergrad and learning about the different biological systems, I had immunology and a biochemistry professor who like just woke me up to the idea of um, doing scientific research for a living. And a lot of people don't know this, but if you go into a doctoral program, your entire education is paid for. So, or your entire graduate education. So you receive a stipend, you don't have to pay tuition, and you get free health insurance. And the idea is that you focus 100% on making scientific discoveries. And
That's
I
so
thought
badass. That's so
it
cool.
is, it is. You don't make a lot of money coming out. That's the
Mm,
downside.
right.
But really, what it is the hook. The hook is when you discover something that the rest of the world is unaware of right now. You've uncovered some secret of nature that nobody else knows.
Ooh.
That's very addicting.
What's that feeling like?
So we would have these we'd have these jokes. Remember the old pinup posters of a lovely young lady that people would put up on the wall?
Yeah.
So I would do that with a good piece of data, some solid finding. I would print out a nice bar graph or what have you, and I just pin it up. And I would just like, as I'm doing my other lab work, I'd look at it and admire it. And it's just like, it just feels really good. I mean, nature and biological systems are extremely complex, and we being human beings are really gifted in our ability to manipulate and understand it. And when it's just you have a secret. You have a secret of the universe that nobody else knows at that moment, and it's addicting.
That is that's a cool way to put it. You have a secret the universe doesn't have.
Yeah.
That's so badass. And did you just kind of like stumble into the HIV stuff, or was this like my friend John sounded like he just got hooked up with a professor that was during doing neuroscience, and then he kind of just fell into it.
It's
Was
sort
there
of
a
the same
plan
thing.
for you?
It's sort of the same thing.
Yeah.
Um, my I was in a rough situation in my last year of undergrad because I had transferred in and I was in this weird scenario where I needed a certain course to graduate that I hadn't had the prerequisites, and I was just being hammered with upper level biology courses. And I used to study in this little desk outside of my biochemistry professor's office slash genetics professor, and she was just the best. And she saw me really struggling here, and she says, "You know what? I know this gentleman at Albany Med, and he does research on HIV. And you know, if you have once a week where you can go down there and work with him, what I can do is I can have that count as an elective. We can drop that one course and reduce your burden." So I said,
Whoa.
"Sure, that sounds awesome." And then when I got there, it's very different when you're in a real research lab. It's just it doesn't
How is it
feel
different?
so when you're in a teaching lab, like a lab, like a chemistry lab in college, there's a set number of protocols and you're just kind of going through the motions. When you're in a real research lab, there's protocols and there's things you do, but you don't know what's going to happen. It's
Hmm.
real science at that point. And so that becomes very exciting. It's a mystery that you're trying to solve.
It's almost like the ones in the classroom setting, you kind of have an anticipated ending or a conclusion to it. But when you're in
Exactly.
the research lab, you're like, oh shit, who knows?
Exactly. That's exactly it. That's a
Right.
perfect way to put it. So that time that I spent working with him at Albany Med eventually led to a technician position where I got more involved, and then eventually to a graduate position and so forth.
Ah, gotcha. Man, what a road to get you. Now you're teaching at Lemoyne, right?
I am teaching at Lemoyne. After it's only for a 1 year appointment. My main concern is getting out this paper. I always, pour my heart and soul into everything I do. So the students at Lemoyne are getting the best education that I can give them, and the feedback's been great. Fantastic students over there. Um, but I also have a master's student who's finishing up at my previous institution, and he's going to be an author on this work as well. So my primary goal is to get this paper out. Then I'm probably going to take a solid year to kind of just relax and focus on, um, I don't know, maybe getting getting that black belt in
Oh snap.
BJJ.
Oh snap. I like that. I like
If
that.
if my shoulder heals, if I can not have any more injuries.
Yeah, that's the worst. That's a jujitsu is always like you always when you talk to a jujitsu guy, they're always like, "Yeah, my knee or my ankle or my fingers are all jacked up and they got like gnarled hands." That's the
Yeah,
only
and
bad side.
they'll tape themselves up like a mummy just to keep going.
Yeah, yeah, 100%, 100%. So, when you started to make the transition to teaching, how have you structured? Was this your first year teaching, and did you have like a plan going into it?
So most professors will have a balance of teaching and research.
Oh,
Sometimes
okay.
it skews in more on one end versus the other. But I started teaching right as I became an assistant professor and doing research at the same time.
Okay.
So I found teaching to be great. The students are fantastic. It's another thing that's just as addicting as getting a good piece of data is recognizing that aha moment in a student where you've given them knowledge and suddenly their entire perspective on the world has changed in a way that allows them to do what they're ultimately going to do much better, to have a greater understanding of their field. And that aha moment can be just as addicting as a good piece of data. So I like teaching, and I like research.
That's a nice little I've always said that real estate is a job that I get to fill my cup and fill somebody else's, right? I get to feel fulfilled at the end of the day because I helped somebody with close a chapter on the mom passing away, or maybe they're having a new baby and they need to expand. Like I get to be a part of that. That's what teaching, that's what gravitates me towards teaching so much, is it's another opportunity I could fill somebody's cup and also fill my own, because it's like watching them, the like you said, watching them have that aha moment. And that's why I love on my Friday class, is because I give you a technique and this people are stance switching and going back to southpaw to orthodox, and then you see the people are like, now I got this flow to the combo, and they're just
Right?
rolling through it seamlessly. You're like, God, I
Right?
love
It's a
seeing
good
that.
feeling.
Yeah, I love seeing that. I love seeing that. It's so cool. What so I guess with being a virologist, have you been following all the research and data with COVID and coronavirus? Which is part of the reason why I wanted you on here, was
Oh,
because
absolutely.
I wanted some expert opinions on what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I obviously from the very beginning, I've followed it closely, and I will have the little caveat to say that I am technically not a coronavirus biologist, but um,
And there
it's
are separate, different biologists that focus on different like illnesses, right?
right. So
Like
it's kind of like
HIV.
a cardiologist versus a pulmonologist, a heart versus a lung physician. There's
Uh,
going to be overlap in their knowledge, but there's also
right,
going to be certain things that are very specific.
right.
That having been said, just by my educational background and my ability to understand the literature, etc., I will have a better understanding than the general public. So I'm happy to communicate that.
Does like all the information that you read about it, does it come through the scientific journals? Is that how you usually read up on data?
For the most part, but there are also scientists that have really good podcasts. One that I would recommend is This Week in Virology. These guys are really good at just kind of hashing out the science, and they're willing to say when they're right and when they're wrong or when it changes. I think that something that's very important to, and I think people know this, but it needs to be said, and they need to just kind of have that be brought to the surface, is that the it's like when you first started, when you walked through the door for the first time and started doing Muay Thai compared to now, your knowledge base and your skill set and your ability to handle certain things are dramatically different and better than they were when you first started.
Right,
So when the pandemic happened, the information, our knowledge about what's happening, the information is fuzzy and it slowly gets clear. And in this pathway of learning about the virus and learning about the disease and learning about the social aspects of it, there's a lot of fuzziness where information ebbs and flows and changes. And some people can interpret that as either misinformation or nobody knows what they're talking about and they get
right,
frustrated. And
right.
I understand that. But I think it's important to focus heavily on the stuff that is always seems to be strong and holding true, and to understand that eventually the closest approximation to the truth will come out, and to be a little bit forgiving and patient when things seem to be contradictory or are mixed up.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely so much different than it was April 2020. Everybody was scared. Like nobody even wanted to go out of their house because they didn't know what to expect. And here we are, like 2 years later, where now we have a vaccine, a booster, and a lot more looser guidelines on things. When everybody's starting to have a plan of attack for these things, like getting like 2 years to me sounds like a pretty quick turnaround for a vaccine, right? So how does somebody who thinks that it was too quick to come out? I feel like there's a lot of people working on this vaccine. And when did we have? We it was April, and then was it by the end of the year we had a vaccine for it?
Yeah, I think that was an astonishing feat
That is
that
so
happened.
cool. That
Yeah,
is so cool.
and I don't blame people for being concerned about the fast turnaround time, because it gives the impression that things were, um, when they were rushed, that there were things that skipped, there were corners that were cut, and that the
Right.
data isn't sound or that there's problems. But you have to think about it like remodeling your house. It all depends on money. Time is money and money is time. So if I have a little money, I can maybe remodel the bathroom. And then a little later on, when I accumulate a little bit more money, I can remodel the kitchen. And over the course of a few years, I can have the house that I wanted. And that's how typical vaccine development works. It takes
A little
several.
bit at a time.
Exactly. The key difference here is now if this old house came along and they said, we want to use your house and put it on PBS or YouTube now, and we're going to dump all this money into it. Well, that house would get that bathroom, that kitchen, that paint, the whole thing would be done
Right.
in.
And in like a month, right? Boom.
Exactly, exactly. And it's going to get done well because everybody's watching. And that's essentially what happened with the vaccines. The technology had been in development for a very long time, but just like anything else, if you dump a whole bunch of money on it, it's going to get done and it's going to get done fast and well.
A whole hell of a lot quicker than when you have to fight for dollars and fight for
Exactly.
sponsors to continue your research, as
Exactly.
opposed to the government being like, "Holy shit, there's a lot at stake here. Please, everybody, find a cure for it."
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And when um when the thing, I feel like that was such a great way to put it because I don't think a lot of people compartmentalize it like that. But that is such a great way to put it that it's like, well, duh, if we throw a lot of money at something, it's going to get done a whole hell of a lot quicker. And I would imagine that there's a lot of labs that probably shifted their focus from HIV work to coronavirus
That's
work.
exactly what happened. A lot of labs all over the country shifted.
And coronavirus has been around for a while, right? With
Yeah.
different strains. Is that
So
misconception?
So the coronavirus is one type of virus, and coronaviruses. So this is another important thing: is that cor- I guess I okay. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit, and I'm going to actually start with where these things are coming from. So a lot of people buy into the theory that the SARS-CoV-2, that this pandemic was a virus that came from a lab and got released out into the world and created this pandemic. And I'm not a sociologist or psychiatrist, but the reason for that is because that is a much more comfortable thing to believe than the terrifying truth. And the terrifying truth is that we are all subject, follow me here, to the second law of thermodynamics, which says that the universe must always tend towards disorder. So if I took an egg, for example, and I dropped it, what would happen to the egg?
I would shatter.
It would shatter and smash and make a mess. That's the second law of thermodynamics in action. Now, technically, if I wanted to, I could rebuild that egg and restore it to its original shape. That would take me to actually cause more randomness and chaos and disorder by expending an enormous amount of time, energy, and resources, and it still may never be perfect. So, what that means in more colloquial terms is that shit happens. And when you come face to face with the realization that sometimes, for reasons that aren't obvious and that aren't clear and that we can't necessarily predict, there is a very real possibility that you or your loved ones, your life will either be dramatically changed or lost for reasons beyond your control. So it's much more comforting to say that this virus was created in a lab and came out and escaped. These are the bad guys. And if we stop
Right.
them, this will never happen again.
Yeah.
But the reality is that multiple microorganisms are out in nature at this very moment. They're constantly, other viruses, coronaviruses included, constantly moving back and forth from one organism to the next. And most of the time it fizzles out. Sometimes the microorganisms establishes a new host. This is constantly happening. Hold on, I got to remove Blix here.
Oh, Blix.
She's a cute little cat. So a lot of times,
Now it's like a parrot. Now she's gonna
Yeah.
sit on your shoulder.
This is probably gonna have to get edited in post. But so it's a terrifying reality that this is happening all the time, that these viruses, these other infectious agents are moving from organism to organism, and they're dipping their toes in the water. A lot of times it'll fizzle out, but sometimes it will take off and it will spread and it'll make its way into humans and then spread through the human population. So if we ignore that this is the reality of how things work and we try to pretend that it came from a lab and blame a situation that isn't the case, then we're going to be completely blindsided when happens again, and it will happen again. So,
Right.
so these coronaviruses are one of many types of viruses that have what are called a broad tropism. What that means is that each virus absolutely has to infect a cell, but the type of cell, the organism for which the cell is present, can be different. So, for example, smallpox virus is a strictly human pathogen. What that means is that human beings are the only host for smallpox,
I didn't know that.
which is why we were able to eliminate it as an infectious disease.
Hmm.
Coronaviruses, they have a broader tropism. What that means is they can infect several different mammals.
Mm.
And eventually, it just by changes that occur in the virus over time, it had the right changes somewhere, somehow, at some point, it made its way into humans. And then it probably
And
happened
spread.
more than once. And
Right.
it probably fizzled out, but then one change gave it an advantage, and suddenly it became a human to human disease. So it's out in the environment, and coronaviruses are spreading. And this is not the first time that this has happened. So we've had coronaviruses make their way from the natural environment to the human population several times before.
Oh.
The two common cold coronaviruses are thought to have emerged probably in a very similar fashion to SARS-CoV-2 and probably spread throughout the world. And at some point, an equilibrium was reached between the what are now the common cold coronaviruses. So it's likely that those viruses spread, a lot of people died, an equilibrium was reached, and now we have this equilibrium where the virus gets to replicate but doesn't kill us, and we just get the sniffles.
Right.
Then another coronavirus made its way, jumped into the human population, SARS-CoV-1. This happened around 2003. And this was scary because that SARS coronavirus actually had much more severe disease. But there was a fundamental difference. That virus was most transmissible when you had the most symptoms. So
Uh.
when you were sickest is when you were most transmissible. What that
Uh.
means is we can identify and quarantine before the virus spreads.
Right.
Same thing happened with the MERS coronavirus in 2011. It jumped from dromedary camels to the human host. Same
Whoa.
thing. Yep,
From
very
camels
severe.
to humans.
It's thought it went from bat to camel to humans. Yeah,
Wow. Holy shit.
but it didn't get human to human, luckily, because it was a very severe disease, and those who got it were very sick, and the maximum transmission was when they were very sick. The
Hmm.
difference with this virus is that it is not as severe, which means, and it is most transmissible when the person is either asymptomatic, meaning they're not experiencing any symptoms, or they have very mild symptoms. So we can walk, we can breathe, we can talk, and it's going to spread like wildfire.
Right.
And as a result, it has spread globally. And the other issue with that particular coronavirus that we're dealing with now in the pandemic is that it has, I don't know if you're aware of Roman mythology, the god Janus with the two heads.
No.
This particular strain of virus is two-faced. For most individuals, it's an asymptomatic infection. It doesn't cause any significant problems. You might get a some discomfort for a week or two, and for other individuals, you end up suffocating to death.
Right.
So it's dramatic, but coronaviruses are out there, they're in nature, they're constantly circulating, and it just so happened that this one had the right combination to make its way through the human population. And
Yeah, that's what it's I think it's easier for people to blame it, like you had said, on a Wuhan lab in China. When I did say earlier, it is nice being in an age of technology where you could literally Google anything. But there's also a flip side of that coin, is you get stuck in an echo chamber of the same information of all the same people, and you never think outside the box. And I think that's a case of some people who are still thinking this originated in a freaking lab in China.
yeah, and,
It's just so strange.
and if you're unaware that this type of thing is happening all the time in nature and it's going to happen again, and it's more comfortable, like I said, to blame somebody, then you're more prone to believe that. The other thing you got to realize is that, and I'm probably saying this wrong, but Wuhan is not like some random place in out in a rural area that has like a research facility. It's a major metropolitan area. So what
Oh, I didn't
like
know
Yeah, so it's kind of like New York City in a way.
that.
So what likely happened is that an individual possibly exposed elsewhere, like a lot of people, migrated to this major metropolitan area, which is it's a transportation hub as well. So it connects to many different regions, just like any big city here. They came in, and then quickly the virus spread. Now, out in the rural environment, you're not going to detect that there's this uptick in this severe pneumonia. But when suddenly people are clustered in a big city that has
City.
exactly resources, hospitals, technology, you're going to detect that there's a dramatic increase in a particular type of pneumonia. And then what you're going to do is you're going to go to the research institute that's in the same city and say, hey, can you look at these samples? They're going to have the personnel, they're going to have the technology, and they're going to look and they're going to say, yeah, there's something new here, and we should warn the world. So it looks like it comes from Wuhan and this research, this
Right.
virology research, but in reality, that's how you know it's there. It made it to a place where it could be seen.
Right. Right. And you have said that like this could very well happen again in the future of another strain of some kind of virus, whether it be COVID or not, or coronavirus or not. How does the virologist community, how do they prepare for something like that?
That's a fantastic question. The answer is we have to go out into the wilderness and we have to survey, and there's ways to do this safely. What we do is we take samples from animals, we take fecal samples, we take any number of samples that we can get our hands on. And there are ways to safely look at the genetic information, sort of get an idea of what's out there. Once we have an idea of what's out there, we can kind of relate it and say, okay, for the things that have made its way into the human population, the common cold coronaviruses, SARS-1, now SARS-2, the influenza viruses, for all of these viruses that have made their way into the human population, are there any similarities between these now human viruses and these viruses that are existing out in nature? And what that does is it gives us a heads up. It says, okay, this one has what is called pandemic potential.
Hmm.
So we can start to study and prepare. And we could be wrong. It may not make its way. But if we don't look, then we 100% are not going to know when it's coming. So
Right.
surveillance is the answer. Go out and look
And try to just basically get as much data from the outside world.
and predict what might happen. Yep.
Right. Right. And now it seems like with all these different viruses, there's all these different plan of attacks, especially like the one you had said earlier, where it's like, here's your wanted poster. Then there could be one. What are other ways that some viruses are cured through vaccines? Is it usually like, here's the wanted poster, or is there other ways?
There are other ways. So sometimes drug development will work. And a lot of times, what companies will do is they have a sort of repertoire of various drugs that they've made. And what they'll do is they'll test the drug in like cell culture, cells in a dish, and see if it has the ability to inhibit the virus. And then those that do are further tested maybe in animal models, and it works its way up the chain. And then what will happen is if we have a strong candidate, so it's kind of like we have all these different drugs and we start testing them all out in a very safe system, see any ones that show any signal that they can block infection. Then we move it up to the animal models, and let's say some of the animal models, drug number 1 and 2 looked good, but it kills the animal or makes the animal sick. We can't use it. 3 and 4 didn't make the animal sick. Okay, so can we now move into a phase 1 clinical trial, which is basically we're going to dose it up slightly in people and see if there's any adverse side effects. Okay, it looks like there's no adverse side effects. Then we move on to phase 2, which says, okay, is it effective? Does it work? And then in phase 2, you take your population that is at a high likelihood of being exposed, let's say, to a particular disease. You have them take it versus a placebo or whatever the standard of care is. And does it work? Is there a statistic difference where it works better than either nothing or what we currently have? And if that works, you expand the number of people to a phase 3, which is essentially the same. Does it work? But now we're testing, instead of maybe 1,000 people, we're testing 30, 40, 50,000 people. And so at that point, you get much stronger data that, yeah, this particular compound works. So the 2 new drugs that have been developed were essentially developed in that way. Forgive me, I forget the name of them off the top of my head, but
It's probably super hard to remember. It's like probably 12 different consonants jammed together.
Yeah, I would totally butcher it if I said it. But there's not even enough of them out there yet to be used therapeutically for the masses, but they're really good at blocking viral replication. So, and they likely emerge through just testing a panel of different chemicals and moving it up the ladder like that until we found something that was relatively harmless in humans and relatively effective at treating the disease.
Man, I'm so glad there's people smarter than me doing this kind of stuff.
Here's the thing, though. Here's the thing, and a lot of people say that because I tell them what I do, and they're like, "Oh, you must be so smart." I am no smarter than you. I 100% guarantee you could do what I do, and it's just a matter of different paths in life. That's all it is.
Just going to school for how long? How long did you go to school for?
Oh boy, 10 years,
right?
10 years, yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Jesus, to get your doctorate, like that's insane.
Yeah, but it's just a matter of like, what's your passion? You're a 4-stripe purple belt. You're gonna be a brown belt soon.
2-stripe.
Yeah, I
Two-stripe, baby.
grappled you. You're pretty much a brown belt. So,
Yeah, soon.
but how long did that take, right?
Long time.
It's just a matter of like, if that's something that you're into, you can do it. So, I wouldn't say that anybody's smarter than you. They just took a different path.
That's very nicely put. Do you have plans next? So after next year you finish your paper, you focus on putting that out. What's next? Is it getting back in the lab? Is it teaching more? Is it maybe writing a book or something? I don't know.
That's a great question. To be honest, I don't know. Like, I feel like I kind of just gonna wait and see what the opportunities are out there for me. Part of me just kind of wants to like build a lab in my basement. You know what I mean? And like teach part time and just kind of like cut through all the red tape and the
John,
bureaucracy.
I think that's how like Spider-Man villains start. It's like they build a lab in their basement. And then soon you're gonna like turn into a crocodile, dude. I don't know if I Killer Croc John.
Oh, that's hilarious. Well, I mean, I guess I could also just seek out like another professorship, but like I said, there's a lot of bureaucracy and red tape. It took a long time to get my work to a certain point because there was a lot of hurdles that I wasn't expecting to cross. But I don't know. We'll just wait and see.
Will you go back into work with HIV, you think?
Yeah, probably. It's a very interesting virus. It's taught us a lot. And like I said, it's been used in ways that were never predicted when HIV first came out. But I'm not opposed to studying other viruses. I honestly, I love science. It's just very fascinating to me. I could go in anywhere. If I had the knowledge base, I'd even go into like quantum physics because,
Whoa,
yeah, I told you
that
it's going to be
sounds
nerdy.
that sounds wild. Quantum physics.
Yeah. I listen
What
to some
being
science
such
podcasts.
like a virus nerd junkie, I don't know whatever the hell you want to call it. Is there one particular virus that has like a wild, crazy story? Like everybody knows like the Black Plague story, right? In medievals, rats ate food and then people ate the food and got sick from that. Is there any virus that you just like loved to learn about because it was so unique or interesting?
Oh, that's a good question. They're all very, very, they all have unique characteristics about them. I think honestly, HIV, I would say HIV is probably one of the most interesting viruses
Do you
that,
think it's because of the era, the time period of when it came about? What
so
makes it so interesting?
all right, so check this out. All right, so the way HIV replicates is it starts with an RNA genome. And you don't even have to worry about what RNA is. It gets converted to DNA, and then it takes that DNA, which is the blueprint to make more HIV, and it inserts it into the host cell. So now
Jesus.
the information to make more HIV is part of your cellular DNA for any cell that it infected, which is why it's so hard to cure. The
Wow.
information is hiding there. And if you look at the human genome, it looks like there were these events that happened throughout our history where a virus very similar to HIV did that. It inserted genetic information into our cells. And
Mm.
some of that information stuck with us as we developed as organisms to become human beings. And there's more and more evidence that those little fragments of previous HIV like viruses that infected us are still in our genome and have important roles. So, for example, the development of the placenta, there's a protein that's involved in helping that placental formation that is thought to have originated from an HIV like virus that infected us many, many, many years before we became human. And
Interesting.
now our bodies have usurped that as a tool. And if you look at the genome of, let's say, a chimpanzee versus a human being, the the genetic information, the code is very similar, probably 99 some percent similar. And the biggest differences between the chimpanzee and the human are in these retroviral elements, these remnants of previous viral infections that look like HIV like viruses that infected us over time. So in other words, our the viruses that have infected us over the course of our evolutionary development are essentially, you could argue, what are making us human.
Really? Wow. So you
Be-
think
Yeah.
there's signs that we were infected before with a disease like HIV, like in the past?
Yeah, there's a lot of
Wow.
evidence that there's pieces of remnants of previous infections just like that in our development. And the big difference between us and chimpanzees and similar organisms is in those elements, those little viral pieces. So it could be that those previous infections are what made us human.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
yeah.
You just blew my mind on that.
I'm telling you, that's the field I'm in. That's why this stuff is
Jesus.
fascinating.
Ah, man, what question do I even ask after that? That's that's kind of scary, but also kind of cool. It's like mm, I've always wondered what's been the evolution from what caused us to evolve from monkeys? Like what was it? Was it a need for more food, more housing? Was it we wanted more? I don't know. Like I don't know.
It's probably a mix of everything, but the data
And
is
HIV apparently, or a
well,
disease like
yeah,
HIV.
they're called
Some
human endogenous retroviruses, or HERVs.
HERVs.
Yep.
HERVs.
Yeah.
Huh.
It's cool
Wow.
stuff.
Do, is there signs that something like that have evolved other species as well? Like not even just like fish or something?
Yeah, actually, this has happened in other animals. And like one of the issues with, for example, using pigs for organs to transplant into humans is that for us, these endogenous viruses have been essentially shut down. They're just pieces of, there's no intact functional virus anymore. It's just pieces of information. But in some of these other animals, they can make functional virus. So if you transplant like a pig heart into a human, which has been done, there's a risk that these
Whoa.
other viruses could reactivate. So
Whoa.
it's a concern for transplants. Yeah,
I didn't even know they were doing pig organ transplants.
yeah. It's
Jesus.
pigs are surprisingly close to humans in a lot of
Wow,
ways.
really?
Yeah.
Is it still it's not it can't be nearly as close as monkey DNA, right? No way.
Oh, as far as
We're
the
probably
genetic level,
pretty close though.
oh, that I don't know. But I
Damn.
would say that, like, in terms of organs, pigs surprisingly have a lot of similarities. Where if we could, which is kind of good, because if we could get around some of the biological issues, it might be close enough where we could use that as an alternative to human transplants.
Jeez. I Science is wild.
Yeah, I'm telling you,
Science is
right?
wild. That is it's such a cool field, and especially like when I talk to somebody like you or I my friend John Hess is like my only other friend that I have in my life who is a scientific person. He's a neuroscientist, and I gave you a little bit of the breakdown. And it's just so cool, like his lab is like focusing on like how to find triggers for Alzheimer's or schizophrenia, like brain, like all brain stuff. Then you have this field, which is like there's some overlapping similarities just in terms of like how the labs work and how you guys like get funding and stuff like that. But
Yeah,
just
we
in
should have a
terms of like,
discussion. I would like to talk to him at some point. I'm sure there's
yeah,
a lot of stuff we could
he's
share.
a he's a cool guy. He's always been ever since we were young, growing up. We always knew he was the smart one out of all of us. We knew that he was going to do some smart shit, and here he is like researching like all these like brain genomes and brain markers for having higher risks of all these different brain. Like it's really cool to see all these different scientific communities, and it's just not just like one blanket one. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And that's why, like, I fall asleep listening to physics podcasts. It's way out of my field, but like it's still
Which, by the way, I think is so funny that we literally podcast. You could type in any hobby that you have in your life, and you will find 10 amazing podcasts that are all on that information. And you showed me one earlier, virologist podcast. I never would have thought that was a podcast.
and it's a great resource for
I
people trying
love
to like
that.
cut through the BS and try to figure out what the information is. And you'll see the data will change with time. And you got to be careful when you rely on CNN and Fox News and Yahoo and social media, because they're going to take whatever little bit of information out there and blast it out there as the truth, and it's not necessarily hashed out.
Yep. Amen.
Dude,
Science is always fluid and always evolving and changing.
so I didn't even hear about the Cory cast until I was talking to you. I just finished the episode with your grandmother.
Oh yes, dude. I will say it's my all-time personal favorite episode. That with my grandmother and my wife. Those are my two favorite episodes.
So I got a lot of the back catalog to catch up on, obviously, but I will say that, this is a great podcast. I
Oh,
like the
thanks, man.
diversity of people that you've interviewed, and it's like, what was that, the seventh or eighth one in, or something
Yeah,
like that?
yeah. So I try like when I started the podcast, I didn't want to just do just a real estate podcast because I felt like it would really like push out a lot of people and like that it would be like a really small niche. So I was like, I'll just talk to anybody and everybody. So it's like, let's see, I've talked to therapists, talked to martial artists, obviously, uh, marketing experts, real estate experts, mortgage lenders, home inspectors. It's all in my field. Video game streamers. Uh, Man, what else? I feel like I now want to go through the list and like name it off, but I like it because it's just plus I get to learn more about what you do, John.
Yeah, I
Like
think this is so cool. I'm so glad you do this, and I'm actually glad I had the opportunity to talk because, I know a lot of people at Taikai are just kind of like don't really know what's going on out there, and they listen to your podcast, and hopefully maybe I made some things a little bit clearer, and they now they know they can come up to me with any questions they have, and I'm happy to
exactly.
answer.
Hopefully you didn't just open up a Pandora's box of a shitstorm. Everybody knocking on your door now.
It's fine. I mean, I don't mind. I will.
I think you and I are very similar in the sense that we like to be a source of people's information. I think that's like to me that feels like why you enjoy teaching and scientific discovery so much.
Absolutely. And I want people to know one very important thing. I will not hesitate to change my opinion or my mind on something if the preponderance of the data supports it. So while I might feel strongly at this point, if the evidence says overwhelmingly that I'm wrong, I will admit that I am wrong. And I'm not afraid to do that.
Amen. I think any good scientist is like that, right?
Exactly.
That's
Exactly.
right. That's right. Dude, thanks for doing this. I appreciate your
Absolutely.
time on a Saturday afternoon.
I
Almost forgot what time
appreciate
it
you
was.
having me.